Buenas noches, buenos días, buenas tardes a todos y bienvenidos una vez más a Suglatam Sessions. Qué bueno verles, tenerles de vuelta. Hemos tomado un tiempito, pero ya estamos de vuelta aquí. Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches a quien se conecte a esta hora. ¿Qué tal todos con esos ánimos, con buena música, ya saben, siempre aquí en su canal del Suglatam Sessions? Nos encanta. Pues bien, today we'll have to switch our language switches to English because we have a very good guest today. He's, oh my god, I cannot start saying everything that we have in store. So let me introduce him real quick. He has been 8-time Sitecore MVP, and here is the fact in which you're going to recognize who I'm talking about. He's the organizer of Sitecore Launch. You know him, you already know him. You can find him in his blog. He's also a Symposium SUGCON Sitecore user group connoisseur with more than 20 speaking engagements and presentations. And he's an independent consultant in Atlanta, GA. Please welcome Corey Smith. Hello, Corey.
Hello. What an introduction. Thank you.
Oh my god, yes. Well deserved. How have you
Thank you
been?
very much. I'm doing great. How about
Nice.
you?
Doing great. High energy, hopes up.
Yeah,
This is Latin America. We have the fire in the blood.
absolutely. I really appreciate you switching to English for me. I would have trouble in Spanish.
Oh, yeah. Well, we've talked a little bit about this. You will not have any troubles in Japanese.
Yes, I will. But thank you.
Yeah, for sure, Corey, and welcome. Today we're going to have a very interesting talk from your side. So happy to hear you.
Thank you.
So if you want, go ahead. The stage is all yours.
All right. The YouTube broadcast is a little bit behind. Are you sharing my screen now?
Oh yeah, yeah. Sorry, that happens.
Okay.
It's like
All right.
usually five
Well,
or 7 seconds. Yeah, but go
all
ahead.
right.
You
Well,
can say.
great. Thanks a lot, Vladimir. Appreciate the excellent introduction. It's the best intro I've ever had. And thanks everyone for having me here today and enduring an English speaking presentation. I'm going to be presenting on tips and tricks in for Next.js and Sitecore Headless. I can't do a better introduction than Vladimir just did for me. But I'm Corey Smith, independent consultant based in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. I am an 8-time Sitecore MVP with over 9 years of Sitecore experience. I'm happy to add to an 18-month-old, and I am a lawn care and smooth jazz enthusiast. If you're on the Sitecore Slack, you can find me at Sitecore, and my website is coreysmith.co. As Vladimir said, I host Sitecore Lunch every Friday at 12:15 p.m. Eastern Time with fellow Sitecore MVP and my good friend Jim Patillo. Sitecore Lunch, um, again, it's 52 weeks a year on Friday, 12:15 p.m. Eastern Time. If you'd like to join us, we talk about Sitecore, we talk about all kinds of things. Probably these days less Sitecore and more other things, but at 12:15 p.m. on Fridays, I'll post the details to join us on Zoom in the general channel on the Sitecore Slack. And if you're not on the Sitecore Slack, then please come and join at sitecore.chat, that URL there. And you can see this is a photo of a normal group. Vladimir actually joined us for this one. It's nice to have him. So I hope to see you all at Sitecore Lunch this Friday. All right, well, let's get started. So our first tip is going to be looking at the debug logging functionality in Sitecore's Next.js SDK. So Sitecore's Next.js SDK, it ships with some debug logging functionality provided by an npm package called Debug. And when enabled, you'll get loads of handy debug info in the console for your server and in the browser for things like layout service requests and dictionary service requests. So this is really helpful for debugging issues with your site. The functionality is actually hiding in plain sight in every Next.js project. In your .env file, if you want to enable this debug logging, all you have to do is uncomment this line right here. And basically what this does is this turns on debug logging for everything that JSS has to offer. But you can actually get more selective. If you uncomment this line here, where you can see we've got :layout after Sitecore JSS, this will actually filter to just layout service debug logs. And you can get even more granular than that. If you uncomment this line, what it'll do is it will show everything but the layout service logs. So you can really tweak this to exactly what you want to see when you're debugging an issue. One thing that you won't see in the .env file is this setting here. It's debug underscore multiline equals true. You're going to want to add this to your .env file. And what this is going to do is it's just going to make your debug logs a lot more readable. So let me show. So by default, if you go and uncomment that line that I showed before and enable the debug logs, this is what your server console is going to look like when you're doing things with your site. But if you've got debug multiline equals true turned on, then it's a lot more parsable and it's a lot more readable. I definitely prefer this view. So that's something to make note of when you're using this. Make sure you turn that on. There are a whole bunch of debug filters that you can enable. So if you want to see everything at that first row, you would just do Sitecore-JSS : ***, and that'll show all the debug logs. But you can get more granular. Like I said, if you want to look at just the data fetchers, you can filter down to that. You can look at just layout service and dictionary service debug logs, editing host. If you're using Headless SXA, they have debug logging for the sitemap service, the site info service, and they've even, if you're using CDP and personalized, they've got debug logs built in for that too. So that was looking at the debug logs on the server, but if you want to enable debug logs in the browser, you can do that as well. It's a little bit different. If you set it in your .env file, that's not going to affect the browser. So in the browser, what you would do is you would just open up your browser console and you would set the debug property on local storage to whatever filter you want to see, like I've shown here. And once you do that, then you'll start seeing debug logs, as I've shown here, in your browser console. Now, uh, most of the stuff in a Sitecore Next.js application actually happens on the server. So if you turn this on in the browser, you're not going to see a lot of stuff initially, but we'll come back to this and I'll show where this can be quite handy. So to recap, you can enable debug logging for the server in your .env file by uncommenting some of those lines. Set debug multiline equals true to make it more readable. If you want to turn on debug logging in the browser, you can do that by just setting the debug property on local storage. And actually, you can add in your own code your own namespaces with debug. And if you're interested in doing that, I recommend you go and check out npm, the debug documentation on the npm.js website, and that'll show you how you can make your own namespaces that you can filter down to. And then Sitecore's got some really good documentation on debug logging as well. Okay, so that's tip number one. Tip number two, we're going to look at the JSS data fetchers provided by the JSS libraries. So the JSS libraries, they come with 3 data fetchers that are available to you and are quite nice to use. And you would use these in place of fetch or Axios if you're trying to make any kind of HTTP calls. And then also there's a GraphQL request client if you're interacting with the Sitecore GraphQL APIs. What I'm going to say is if you need to make any kind of API calls, just like a regular HTTP call, just always use the native data fetcher. It wraps fetch, and this is what you're going to want to use. The Axios data fetcher, you're probably not going to want to use unless you've got some really specific use case. Native data fetcher is what you want. The reason I say that is because Vercel in Next.js, they've got their own implementation of fetch that gets free features as you update Next.js. So things like request deduplication and caching, if you use the native data fetcher, you're going to get those things for free as you upgrade Next.js and as Vercel implements those things, and you won't get those features with Axios. So yeah, use the native data fetcher. But if you're going to be making requests to the Sitecore GraphQL APIs, you'll want to use the GraphQL request client, because what that does is it implements some nice things like it has retry mechanisms, and it also handles rate limiting with the Sitecore GraphQL APIs. So the big advantage of using these over just using fetch directly, for example, is they actually have the debug logging enabled by default. So you'll get to use that, and we'll take a look at that in a second. They're quite easy to use. So to use the native data fetcher, you just import that from the Next.js library, as I've done here. And then you're going to new up a native data fetcher. And from that point, it looks like you're just using like a regular fetch call. So again, you get free debug logging with these. To see debug logging when you're using these things, all you have to do is filter down to the HTTP debug logs. Make sure you turn on multi-line equals true. And when you do that, you can see in your console for any API calls that you make through those data fetchers, you'll be able to see the requests as they go out, and then you'll be able to see the response as it comes in. The cool thing about it is if you use this, say, in a use effect, or you use this somewhere in client-side interactivity, when you turn on the HTTP filter in the browser, then you're going to start seeing those native data fetcher and GraphQL calls show up in the browser console like this. So to recap, use the native data fetcher instead of fetch. Probably not going to need it, but if you use Axios, you can use the Axios data fetcher instead of that. Use the GraphQL request client to call Sitecore GraphQL APIs. And then the advantage of using these, of course, is that you get free debug logging for diagnostics. Okay, so that tip was looking at the data fetchers that you would be using for both server-side and client-side API calls. But now we're going to look at component level data fetching, which is just focusing on making API calls on the server. So let's start by looking at a typical data fetching scenario in a React app. If you've made API calls in a React app before, you've seen this pattern, I'm sure. The way that you make an API call in a React component is you use a combo of the use state and the use effect hooks. So you declare some state with the use state hook, and then inside of the use effect hook, that's where you'll actually be making your fetch calls. And once the API call has finished returning, you set your state. And when you set the state, what it's going to do is it's going to cause your component to re-render. So while your API call is being made, you might show a loader if while the state is null. And then once the API data comes back, then you'll actually show the data. And this is fine, but one of the problems with it is that it uses use effect, and use effect only executes on the client. It doesn't execute during server-side rendering. The problem with that is since it's only going to execute on the client, you're going to see a flash of content when the page loads. So when the page loads, you're initially going to see like the loading message like I showed here. And then as the API data trickles in, then you'll see all the components re-render. And this isn't the best user experience, it can have negative impacts on SEO for your site. So Next.js actually has a solution for this at the page level to make these API calls on the server, and that's by using either the get static props or get server side props methods. And get static props, you use that for static site generation. Get server side props, you use that for server side rendering, SSR. And let's take a look at an example of how to use these. So I'm talking about Next.js right now. I'm not talking about the Sitecore JSS SDKs at the moment. So this is just stock Next.js functionality. And in Next.js, you would declare get static props or get server side props at the page level. And when you do this, you just export, if you're doing SSG, you export a get static props function. And then inside of that function, you can make API calls. And then you just return whatever comes back from your API from that function. And what Next.js will do is it'll pass that data to your page as props. And then from the page, you can pass that down to your components. And this is all magic that Next.js does for you. It's a really nice feature, gives you server-side rendering of API calls, helps you avoid content flash and improve SEO. But since these methods have to be declared at the page level by default, you must do data fetching for all the components on your page here. So imagine if you've got a page that's got 4 components on it, right? In a standard Next.js application, your pages might be static, so you know ahead of time all the components that are going to be rendered. So then in get server side props or get static props, if all of those components are going to need API call data, then ahead of time you can just at the page level request that API data for every single one of your components. I don't think it's that nice, but yeah, you can do this. The thing is, once you get to Sitecore, we don't know ahead of time what components are going to be rendered on a page. In Sitecore, pages are completely dynamic. Content authors choose which components go on a page, so it doesn't really make sense for you to request API data at the page level for all possible components when only a small subset of those are going to be rendered on the page. And the Sitecore JSS team has a really cool solution for this. So let's take a look back at that data fetching example from before. So here I've just got a simple component. We looked at this before. It's using the use state, use effect combo to get data from an API. And if we want to refactor this in a Sitecore JSS Next.js application and start getting this data during server-side rendering or static site generation, it's quite easy. All we have to do is export get server-side props or get static props alongside our component. And this lets us do those two functions at the component level rather than at the page level. And it works just the same as it does at the page level. Like you just export one of those functions alongside your component, and inside of that function, make your API calls. Doesn't have to be API calls. If you've got something that's like a really computationally expensive operation, you can do that here and execute it on the server, and then just return your data from the function. And then Sitecore's JSS SDK will magically pass this into your component, and then your component can consume that data from the server. So this is really nice because it keeps your server-side data fetching code really close to your components. And it also ensures that these server-side data fetching functions are only going to happen when the component is rendered on the page. So it's not going to make useless calls. And yeah, that animation that I showed before, it doesn't need to be animated anymore because once you do that refactoring, the API calls are going to be made on the server and there's not going to be any flash of content. This is really nice. I like this feature. The JSS team did a good job implementing this. However, there is one thing to be aware of. If you are on a version, if you are using the JSS libraries before 21.6.4, there's a huge bug with this functionality that you need to know about. So again, I'm going to repeat this. If you are using these functions in your application right now, and you think you might be on a version using the JSS libraries before 21.6.4, you're going to want to go back and audit your projects after what I tell you right here. This is a big bug. The page level get static props and get server side props are excluded from the client bundle. So again, at the page level, that's something that's implemented by Vercel and the Next.js team. And it makes sense that these functions are excluded from the client bundle that's sent up to your users in the browser because this code only executes on the server. There's no need whatsoever to send that to the browser. Because of that, Vercel actually tells you in the documentation that you can put things like API secrets, you can put connection strings, you can put passwords in those methods. They're only going to execute on the server. You don't have to worry about those things getting up to the client. However, component level the component level versions of these functions are implemented by the JSS team, and there's a bug where those methods are not excluded from the client bundle prior to 21.6.4. So the consequence is that when you're using those component level functions, you must not, under any circumstances, put sensitive data in them. So do not put passwords, do not put API secrets, do not put connection strings, because if you do, people can go and inspect the JavaScript files that get sent up to their browser when they're navigating your site, and they will actually be able to see your secrets. So just be very careful about this. If you're on a version before 21.6.4, just be aware of this. I still think these functions have a lot of value. Just make sure that you're not leaking any secrets about your application. So to recap, you can use get static props and get server side props in your components. If you're on a version of the JSS libraries before 21.6.4, make sure that you upgrade as soon as you can. And if you can't, don't put sensitive data in those component level functions. So for some further reading, here's a link to the JSS 21.6.4 release. It's not the most current version anymore, but you can go and see the pull request where they fixed that bug if you're interested. I actually discovered this issue when I first made this presentation last year and reported it to the JSS team. So if you're interested in checking that out, you can go and look at that issue on GitHub. Sitecore's got some really good documentation on the component level data fetching, and then Vercel's got some good documentation on the page level data fetching that you can check out at those two links. Okay, so with the last tip, we looked at server-side data fetching using the component level data fetching functions. Now we're going to switch up to the client in the browser, and we're going to look at some data fetching libraries to make that easier when you're doing client-side API calls. So going back to our example before, where we're making an API call in one of our React components, you always have to use state and use effect in combo. And yeah, it works. Declare your use state hook, do your use effect hook when the API call comes back, set the state, show a loader while it's loading, show the component when it's done loading. This works, but it's a bit kludgy, and there's a much better, more powerful way to do this. And one of those ways is by using a library called SWR. So Vercel has made a library that simplifies these client-side data fetching calls into one hook instead of two, with their library called SWR, which stands for stale while revalidate. And yeah, like I said, this is maintained by Vercel. So it integrates really nicely with Next.js. And it's pretty easy to use. So now instead of using use effect and use state, now you just use a single hook called use SWR. And the first parameter that you pass to it will be your API URL. So in this case, we're calling the catfact API. And then the second parameter that you pass to it is a generic fetcher function that is responsible for going and getting the data from somewhere. And then what this does is this handles that use effect, use state thing for you automatically, and it will return some useful properties that you can use in your code. So it'll return an isLoading property. And this is a Boolean that will just tell you whether or not the API call is executing. If there's any error that comes back from the API, it'll return the error data, and then, of course, the data that you just need from your API. There are a lot of other things that it returns as well, but these are the most common things that you'll use. So now, instead of looking at your state to figure out whether or not your API is still executing, you can just look at this isLoading property, which is a lot more readable, I think, in your code to determine whether or not to show a loader. So that's not all. It doesn't just make your code cleaner. There are a lot of features that you get for free when you start using SWR. Auto refetching, request deduplication, You can set up dependent queries very easily. So if you have situations where one query depends on another query to execute first, which depends on another one, it's really good at handling those things. Can do prefetching for you or caching, handles pagination and infinite scroll. It's got TypeScript support, a bunch of really great features. And next, we're going to take a look at two of those features in action. So refetch and deduplication are two of the features that you'll notice right away when you start using the use SWR hook. You don't even have to do anything to start taking advantage of these. So the first thing is auto refetching. What I'm doing here in this video is I'm just clicking in and out of the browser. So the browser is gaining focus and the browser is losing focus. And every time I click in and out of the browser, SWR will automatically just go back to your API and refetch the latest data. So that's pretty cool because it makes sure that, if your users like Alt Tab or go and do something and then come back to your application, they're always going to get the latest data automatically and you don't have to implement anything for that. The second thing that's happening here is request deduplication. So I've actually got this cat fact component on the page 4 times, right? And if you were using the use effect and use state combo, what you would actually see happen here is the cat fact component would have 4 different facts, right? Because it would be making 4 separate API calls. But SWR is smart enough to see, hey, I've got this component rendering on the page 4 times. The components, they're all making the exact same API call. It'll make that call just once for you and return that to all the components. So it's a performance saving feature. It's quite nice. Now, you can turn these things off if you don't want them, but again, it's just cool that you get those for free without having to implement anything. I showed previously that when you use the SWR hook, you supply a generic fetcher function. In that example, I was just using fetch, but the cool thing is you can use the JSS fetching functions as well. So instead of using fetch, you could use the native data fetcher. You use that as your generic function and supply it to SWR. And when you do that, then you can get the debug logging for free when you set the debug property on local storage in the browser. It's a nice way to take advantage of that, kind of tie those tips together. SWR also has a really nice browser extension called the SWR DevTools. You can add this to your browser and you'll get an SWR tab that you can use for debugging SWR. So it'll actually show the cache that SWR is using in your app. It'll show the history of calls and a lot of other neat things. So to recap, SWR, it's going to simplify and supercharge data fetching code on the client. But it's not the only game in town. I didn't cover it today, but there's another library called React Query that's a great alternative to SWR. It's got almost feature parity with SWR. It's really great too. I recommend if you're not using either of these in your application, go evaluate both of them and pick the one that works best for your team. So here's the website for SWR and SWR DevTools. And if you're interested in React Query, which I recommend you check it out too, I've used that quite successfully on some projects. Go check out React Query as well. Okay, so for our fifth tip, we're going to kind of combine what we've learned so far to look at how you can mock data in the page editors in Pages or in the Experience Editor. So when you're developing an application for Sitecore, you're really developing two applications. You're, of course, developing the website, the application that your end users are going to see, but you're also developing an editing experience for your authors to build pages. One thing that I feel pretty passionately about is that pages in the experience editor are for designing layouts only. They are not for testing APIs. And when I say this, what I mean is in the experience editor or pages, your components should never be calling APIs. That's not the place for it. Really, what you should have in pages in the experience editor, those API calls should be returning mock data, and just giving your content authors a sense of what the API might be returning, but not actually calling those APIs. One of the biggest reasons for this is that when you call APIs client side, React re-renders and client side rendering can break the experience editor. Like it'll actually cause things not to work at all. And you may have seen this in some of your applications. We can look back at our cat fact example, that component that I built before, and I can show what I mean. So I've seen this pattern quite a lot, causing issues in the experience editor. Um, you've got a case where you are calling an API, and while that API call is executing, you show a loader on your component. But then when the API call finishes executing, then you show the API data plus fields from Sitecore. You might show a nested placeholder and some other stuff. Where you run into trouble with this is blocking loading of the image field helper and the placeholder in this example. Blocking loading of Sitecore field helpers and placeholders is an anti-pattern that will definitely break the experience editor. And the things that you'll see as a result of this pattern is that inline editing won't work. Your component won't render when you first add it in the experience editor. So you might add the component to the experience editor and then you have to save before you can actually see it. In this situation, placeholders won't work. So you might try to add a component into that placeholder I showed before, and you'll get an error in the console, or it'll pop up in an alert saying could not find the rendering in the HTML loaded from the server. So the Pages is a little bit more resilient to this, but the experience editor definitely struggles with this problem. So we can use SWR and component level data fetching to serve up mock data and avoid this anti-pattern. And I'll show you how to do that now. So here we've got our component that's using SWR to make an API call. And we're showing a loader while it's loading. Otherwise, once it's done, we'll actually show the data from the API. And we can refactor this to very easily show some mock data in the experience editor and Pages. The way that we do this is, I talked about before, just export one of those component level data fetching functions from your component. I think my headset shut off. Vladimir, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I think my headset shut off. It shuts off after a while. So
okay.
inside of that component level data fetching function, what you would do is you first check if you're in the experience editor. And that's a pretty easy thing to do. If you're not in the experience editor, don't return anything. Remember, the goal of this is to return mock data in the experience editor. So if you're not in the experience editor, if you're not in Pages, don't do anything. But if you are in one of those editing experiences, then return some mock data. In this case, we're just returning a fact that says mock data for editing. Then, of course, when your component renders, that's going to get passed down as a prop. And what you can do is with SWR, you can pass that prop to a special property called fallback data. What this fallback data does is it says, while the API call is executing, show this data, right? So you won't show a loader anymore. When that API call executes, the fallback data will show initially. The API call will execute in the background, and then once the API call finishes, then the real data will show. That's a pretty cool feature, again, that you get with SWR. However, like I said, we don't want to make API calls when we're in Pages or the experience editor. So we need to turn off that second piece where it executes the API call in the background. That's pretty easy to do, and I'll show you how to do that next. You can go to your Sitecore, you can go to your page component and declare an SWR config element. And then inside of that SWR config element, you can turn off a couple of things. So you can turn off revalidate on focus and turn off revalidate on mount when you're in the experience editor. And so now that we've got this set up, what happens is when we're in the experience editor, it basically tells all SWR calls use the fallback data and never make the API call. So this pattern ensures that our components work properly in the experience editor and pages. You won't have those client-side re-renders happening. You've got mock data for your API calls. And I think that this is a pretty clean pattern. So to recap, don't call APIs, don't do any kind of client-side interactivity in pages or the experience editor, because it will break client-side rendering of the JSS field helpers and placeholders will break the experience editor. You can use get static props and get server-side props at the component level to return API mock data for editing. And then you can use SWR's fallback data to consume that mock data. Then you disable revalidate on mount and revalidate on focus, and that makes sure that your API calls with use SWR won't get executed. Okay, so those last tips were pretty heavy. Let's have some easy ones for a change. And this first tip is just always define a root element. I see this problem quite often. There'll be components that are implemented using the React fragment like this. So instead of having a root element, it just uses like the React fragment, wrapping all of the elements in cases where there's more than one element on the component. This is a very problematic for the experience editor and will break functionality as well. It doesn't matter if you're using React actually, or if you're using Angular. Doesn't matter if you're using XSLT, MVC, web forms. This is problematic across all of these technologies. It's just a thing with the experience editor. It always wants a root element. So don't do that. Don't wrap your component with a React fragment like that. Make sure that your components always have a real root element. Could be a div or a span. Doesn't matter, just can't be the React fragment. If you do that, your content authors will be very happy because the components will work properly. It might be a good idea to implement an ESLint or prettier plugin to detect this issue so that you can catch it at build time, for example. The next tip is privacy focused. So you can disable Next.js telemetry in your apps. Vercel collects a lot of telemetry from your application, and they're trying to get feedback about how you're using Next.js and things that they can improve. But if you or your clients are privacy focused, you might want to turn that off. And it's quite easy to do. In your .env file, just set this environment variable next_telemetry_disabled, set that to 1, and telemetry is disabled. Check it into Git and you're done for that one. Sitecore's got some documentation on this, and Vercel's got documentation on it as well. That's not the only way to disable the telemetry, but that is the easiest. All right, for tip number 8, we're going to look at some functionality in the SDKs that will help you with upgrades. So in the root of your Next.js application, there's a next.config.js where you can configure all of Next settings. The next.config.js file on a new Sitecore Next.js application already has a bunch of stuff configured, and you can configure stuff beyond that. A lot of the Next.js options, for example, are like, what's the dist directory? What are environment variables? What headers do you need set? What you can set up redirects, you can set up rewrites there, you can configure Webpack. However, if you modify these things directly in the next config, it can make upgrades of your project a little bit more difficult. So there's a cleaner way that the Sitecore team has given us, and that's through config plugins. So if you look in your Next.js application from Sitecore, under the source, lib, next config plugins folder, you'll find a bunch of example plugins that Sitecore has already implemented. And these are basically just little bits of code that modify the next config. So you don't have to modify the next config directly. And what happens is at build time, all of these plugins get executed and applied against the next config. and basically generates a big next config for you. If you're coming from the .NET world, this is very similar to config transforms, like for the web config. But yeah, we can look at a simple example. This is what the simplest that it could be, but a practical example might be if you wanted to turn off the powered by header that Next.js sends on every request. So instead of going to the next config.js file, you can make a config plugin in that folder called powered by header, and then there set powered by header to false. And again, at build time, this will get applied to the next config, and yeah, it'll make your upgrades a little bit easier. This is a very simple example, but these plugins can get quite complex. I mean, imagine if you've got a feature that requires a bunch of rewrite or redirect rules, rather than having those kind of split all across the next config in different places. It's nice for those kind of features to keep all of those different settings in one file together, and the config plugins will allow you to do that. Just remember that anytime that you create or change a config plugin, that you'll need to restart your Next.js application with JSS start or Docker compose restart rendering. So to recap, don't edit your next config.js directly. Instead, anytime you want to modify that, you can go create a config plugin and keep those changes out of there. And then just remember to always rebuild your app after creating or modifying plugins. Our next tip is another really cool one. This will help you get a better understanding of your website payloads, and this is called the Next.js Bundle Analyzer. So to get started with this, you're going to install the Bundle Analyzer npm package like this. And once that's installed, create a config plugin because we need to modify the Next.js config. Here, this one's just called bundleanalyzer.js. And what you're going to do is you're going to use the with bundle analyzer config method that comes with that package. And you're going to want to set two things. Number one, you'll set the enabled property to true when the analyze environment variable is true. And you want to turn open analyzer, you want to set that to false. If you set that to true, every time your application builds, a new tab will open in your browser, and it takes like 2 minutes, and you've got 1,000 tabs in your browser from Next Bundle Analyzer. So just turn that off. Don't ever turn it on. It's quite annoying. So once you've got your config plugin in place, you go into your env file and set analyze to true. And after that, when you build your app the next time, then you'll get output of two files in your Next.js application. The first one will be an HTML page for the client bundle, and then the other one will be an HTML page for the server bundle. And the client bundle, of course, is client.html. The server bundle is node.js.html. And this is what the client bundle page looks like. So what it does is it shows you different blocks for each of the JavaScript chunks that get sent up to the browser. You can see there's one for main, there's one for the 404 page, there's one for the page route, there's one for your app. And then if you look at these, you can see that they all include node modules. So these are all the node modules that are going to get sent up to the browser for those pages. Here, if you look, you can see all of the components that are going to get sent up with those pages from your application from the source folder. And you can mouse over any of these blocks, and it'll actually show you the physical size that each of these pieces is contributing to your client bundle. There's a sidebar where you can filter what you see. So you can zoom in on a particular chunk. So say, for example, you just want to look at your page route, you can do that. It'll zoom in on just that, makes things a little bit easier to see. And here you can see that node modules with a stock Next.js application is actually taking up the majority of the bundle. If you see here, you can see the Sitecore JSS libraries that are coming in with node modules. They take up a lot. And then, of course, all the components that are actually getting used by this route over here on the right. Here's the server bundle. Something that you'll notice right away is that on the server bundle, every single one of the chunks has a document.js. You didn't see that on the client bundle, and that's because the document.js file, it will not get shipped up to the browser because that only executes on the server side. So to recap, you can use Next.js Bundle Analyzer to diagnose bundle sizes, use it to find code that doesn't belong in the client, for example, and you can easily enable this with a config plugin. And there's some really good documentation on that that you can read at this URL. All right, and our last tip is on patch package. This is probably my favorite tip. I love this tool. Patch package lets you patch node modules. So if you've ever had a scenario where you needed to change something in your node modules folder and you were like, how do I share this with my team? How do I get this to build and actually go to my app in production? Patch package is your answer. So let's take a look at how that works. First, you install the patch package node module on your app like this. And then in your package JSON file, you are going to add a post install script to call patch package. And what this does is basically just after npm install runs, patch package will run automatically. After you've set that up, all you need to do is go in your node modules folder and start modifying things. So this file is the index.js from the isEven node modules. And say you wanted to make a change with this to ruin your coworker's day, you could go and add in some code to isEven, the isEven function, to make it always return true on Mondays. So yeah, that would surely mess with your team. And once you make this change in node modules, then we switch back over to the terminal. And the first thing that you do is you run patch package and give it the name of the module that you changed. And so what'll happen after you run this command is that patch package is going to run out and it's going to get a clean version of the module that you modified. In this case is even, and it is going to take that clean version and do a diff against your node modules folder. And what it'll do is it will figure out what's different and create a patch file for those differences. And then it'll create that patch and put it in your repo. So you can check that patch file in to source control, share it with your team, and then on builds, like on your build server, that'll automatically get applied to node modules. When your team downloads the repo and runs npm install, the patch will get applied automatically there too. Another cool thing that happens when you run this command is if the package has a GitHub repo, they'll give you a command to create an issue for whatever you just changed. And I highly recommend that you always do that. If you have to modify a node modules, a package in node modules, you need to let the package maintainers know so that they can do things on their end to fix issues or whatever. The patch looks like this. It just looks like a git diff. And this is what's going to get created in the patches folder of your repo. And then, yeah, from that point on, anytime you run npm install on your repo, as soon as npm install finishes, patch package will run and apply the patches to your node modules folder. I just do want to warn you, use this tool sparingly. This isn't something that you should just jump to use all the time, but I mean, there are practical reasons to use this. For example, if there's some types that for whatever reason the JSS team don't export that you don't want to redefine, that's a really good use case for it. If you are stuck on an old version of the JSS libraries and say you wanted to backport that fix that was in 21.6.4 to fix the client secret thing with component level data fetching, this would be a really good use case for that. So, yeah. To recap, use patch package to modify node modules. Patches will get created in the patches folder in your repo. Anytime you do this, make sure you're submitting an issue to the package maintainers and use this sparingly. So all the documentation for that can be found here. And that's it. Any questions?
Insert applause here.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Thank you, Corey. That was very, very interesting tips. Very useful. I
I hope
think
so.
I'm going to tell my coworkers to use them more often. So
Okay, thank you.
yeah, for sure, for sure. So let's see if any questions arise here in our chat. You know, guys, the ones that are viewing us, you always have the YouTube chat to write your questions. I love the powered byte header one for the transformations. Oh yeah,
Yep.
because you know I do transformations all the time, and uh, yeah, I didn't know it existed for JS as well. Was good.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that hidden in the JSS SDKs. So it's nice to be able to kind of evangelize those a little bit and teach about them.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, let me show all your data. You know, guys, all the links that Corey has
Thank you.
shown, all the all the links to his Slack, Mastodon account, LinkedIn account. We have everything. We're gonna be posting them on the video description down below. Um, Thanks to everyone that has sent us their highs, their hellos.
Yes,
I'm
thank you.
gonna just mention them real quick. Mariella, just always a viewer. There's a weird username XATOGBL. Hello, just hello, my friend. Fernando, Mario, Eduardo, Sandy, Victor, Maria, Ramiro. Thanks to everyone for their love, for spreading their love, and of course,
Yep. Thank you for
thank
having me.
you, Corey. Thank you very much. This has been a very insightful tips. We're going to be applying them for sure. And well, without further to say, thank you and see you the next one.
Yep. Have a good night. Thanks for having me.
Have a good
Appreciate it.
night. Thank you. Thank you, Corey. Have a
Bye-bye.
good night, everyone. Bye bye.
This is the rhythm of the night.